Welcome to SDK 2.0. This presentation is all about the resources in our software development kit. Our SDK helps you integrate code with cPanel's products. My name is Sarah Kanairi, and I'm a documentation writer at cPanel. It's my job to turn technical information into easy-to-follow resources on our documentation website. This past year, I've been working on our software development kit, turning it into what we hope is something really useful. So, what is our SDK? Unlike some other software, our SDK is just documentation. Our API is already included in cPanel and WHM, and you can download it from the Manage2 interface. It's important for us to provide everything you need because our integration projects save you time and hone your competitive advantage. Our SDK needed some work, so based on your feedback, we started an overhaul in August of last year, and we published the new version of our SDK, SDK 2.0, in the beginning of January. We've been publishing new guides and improvements ever since. Our goal is to give you everything you need, even if you're a first-time developer. This includes thorough reference documentation with standardized templates, lots of thoroughly tested examples, adding best practices information, detailed tutorials for common tasks, and troubleshooting steps for common issues. Last month, we analyzed over 900 support tickets opened between February 2014 and July 2015 that included SDK-related keywords. We wanted to see whether our efforts had benefited our customers. We analyzed the stats for before and after January 2015 when SDK 2.0 went live. So here's what we found. 24% more support tickets included a link to our SDK now than they did before we published. This is great because it means the SDK answers more of your common questions. We're hoping this also means that the answers are easier for our analysts to find, and if analysts can find the answer faster, they can resolve your ticket faster. We also found that customers are referring to our documentation more often when they open support tickets. They've already found a starting place and have questions about it. Since we published the SDK, we've received 12% fewer support tickets per month about cPanel API 2 related questions. This is great because before we published the SDK, cPanel API 2 questions accounted for a quarter of the support tickets about API-related topics. The average back-and-forth responses between support analysts and customers dropped by 6%, so support tickets are requiring less to get resolved. On support tickets that included a link to our SDK documentation, this was an even bigger drop by over 24%. All of this is, of course, great for us, but also important to you because it means that you can get answers more quickly and receive help more quickly than you could before. We're hoping that our SDK inspires users who've never developed a project before to give it a try. With that in mind, our SDK offers 3 quick start development guides. Every guide has just enough detail for you to get your feet wet. Which one you use is going to depend on your project. cPanel projects deal with user-level tasks. For example, dealing with email accounts, FTP accounts, or databases. WHM projects deal with sysadmin-level tasks. For example, creating new accounts, updating server settings, or using the transfer system. Manage2 projects deal with billing or licensing tasks. For example, you might want to add cPanel license purchases to your website for your customers to purchase. Each of these guides gives a brief overview of the development process for a given product. They all link to the in-depth documents and guides, but without all of the TLDR. This is a great place for first-timers to start out, but it's also a good resource for experienced developers too. You might find a tool or method listed there that you haven't tried before. The process for Manage2 integration is pretty simple. Manage2 projects deal with cPanel licensing and billing again. For example, adding cPanel license purchases to your company's website. You're going to need, of course, a development license for Manage2. You don't want to be doing integration project testing on a production server. Unlike cPanel and WHM, you will need to download some items from the Manage2 interface before you can start developing. Most Manage2 integration projects will use the Manage2 API in some way. And after you write your application's backend code, you will need to authenticate. For cPanel and for WHM, the Quick Start development guides outline fairly similar suggested workflows. This is what most integration projects fall under, so we're going to look a little closer at the steps here. First, every cPanel developer is going to need a development license for at least one development and testing server. It's important not to work on integration projects on a production server, since every time you call the API, it does work on live data. Most projects are going to utilize one of our APIs in some way, so let's talk about those for a minute. The basis for almost any integration project is one of our APIs. Most of you are probably familiar with what APIs are, but just in case, API stands for Application Programming Interface. This is how you use our existing functionality from cPanel and WHM in your custom code. A simple example would be using the WHM list accounts function to grab a list of all of the accounts on a server and display that list in a customized interface, or iterate over it in your code to do something to each account. cPanel produces a total of 6 APIs for our products. When you're starting new development projects, you're going to want to use the right API for your project. Manage2 API, of course, is for Manage2 projects. If you're working on a WHM project, you're going to want to use WHM API 1. And if you're using a cPanel project, you're going to want to use cPanel API 2 or UAPI. We also have 2 deprecated APIs, meaning they might still work, but we're not going to make any guarantees, and we don't make improvements to them anymore. We still document these APIs, but only so that you can update your code to newer functions. Each of our APIs has different calling requirements and methods, which you can find in that API's documentation. One of the best ways to get to know our APIs, test them, and make sure that a function is the function you need is through running the calls in a browser or through the API shell interface. One of these API shell interfaces is in cPanel to run cPanel functions, and the other one is in WHM to run WHM functions. So this is an example of a browser-based call to the WHM API, and calls to the cPanel APIs are going to look pretty similar. You don't need anything special to be able to run the calls this way either. As long as the authenticated user has the right permissions, they can run a function this way just using the security token in the URL when they log in. You basically provide the same information to make a call in the API shell interface. You just fill in the parameters and the desired values, and then press a button to make the call. The advantage to this interface is that it performs the URI encoding for you, and it lets you use drop-down menus to set up pagination, sorting, and filtration options. Either way, you're going to get back JSON or XML data. The Manage2 API will also give you YAML data. We encourage you to use JSON just because XML has a lot of extra requirements to get everything working correctly. The exact information that you get back depends on the specific function and whether or not you used any special options when you called it. Some functions, for example list functions, return a lot of data. Other functions, especially ones that just perform a specific action, like enabling or disabling a setting, might only return metadata. Metadata shows standard error messages and other system information about the call's success. So when you're making those calls, you're going to want to look up functions in our documentation. Our new API documentation combined customer feedback, feedback from our experienced support analysts, and an analysis of other leading API documentation to create pages that easily display all of the information that you need. We've fully documented all 6 of our APIs with code examples for function calls, output examples, and guides with additional special Snowflake information. We now have over 1,000 separate function documents organized by API, version, and module or category. All of them are optimized for searchability so that you can find the function that you're looking for faster. All of these docs use a similar format that gives you all of the relevant information. For example, every document's going to show you a description of the function, code examples in the most popular call methods, plus examples of output in every possible language. This includes examples of browser-based calls that you could just copy and paste into your browser and update the values if you've already got a valid session token. Every document is also going to include tables that list all of the possible input parameters and return values with descriptions and plenty of examples. If you're just testing or playing with functions, this is what you plug into your browser-based calls or into API shell. If a parameter is only in certain cPanel and WHM functions, or if the behavior changes between versions, you'll find that information here. The sidebar includes version information, required parameters, and other statistics for the function. Each API's functions live under a thorough guide for that API. These guides give you a thorough overview of everything you need to know to call that API's functions. We're going to provide information about filtration, sorting, or pagination options if they're available for that particular API. And it's important to note that you really want to use these options in your projects. Using them reduces the server load for functions with a massive amount of output. For example, if you run the WHM list accounts function, you want to filter it for just what you need. Otherwise, you're probably making the server return a bunch of unnecessary items. Every API guide is also going to give you special information about additional calling methods. In some APIs, this includes guides to convert deprecated methods in your code into newer, more up-to-date methods. It's important to note that after we deprecate a system, it might remain available for a long time, but the longer you wait to update your code, the more risk that something will break. So always update to new systems ASAP. Finally, every API guide includes a thorough description of return data, including metadata parameters that aren't in individual function documents. So once you've gotten familiar with the right API functions for your project, it's time to look at the standardized hook systems, and a lot of projects are going to benefit from using this system. This is a great system that we encourage you to use since it lets you customize the behavior of your server, block certain actions based on custom code results, and tack on extra tasks to existing functionality. When you use this system, your custom code will execute at a predetermined point before or after a specific event, like whenever someone uses WHM to create an account, or whenever the system runs a nightly update. Of course, we have plenty of documentation for this system, including a couple of step-by-step tutorials to help you produce completely functional code. This includes reference documents for all of the different types of hook, including hooks that trigger based on any of our API functions, information for several types of hook code, as well as debugging information. Since this system replaced several older hook systems, we've included information on how to move from those deprecated systems to the newer standardized hook system, and advanced options for standardized hooks that let you do even more when you create hook code. Once you've picked which systems you want to use, you then of course have to write your own custom code to use it. We can't always help you write that code, but we do try to provide enough examples to steer you in the right direction, especially if you're writing in PHP or Perl. One of the tasks that gets the most questions is authenticating. Pretty much all custom code will need to authenticate at some point. Our guide to API authentication outlines 4 methods to use to authenticate, with Perl and PHP code examples for every method. It's important to note that the different methods aren't all equal. A lot of projects should use access hash or single sign-on for better security. Once you have back-end code in place, you might also want to create custom interfaces. And in many cases, you'll also need to register your application, particularly if your project is going to be a plugin. Many cPanel integrators are writing plugins for WHM or for cPanel, and it's important to note that the workflow for WHM plugins and cPanel plugins is going to be a little bit different. Our plugin development guides list workflows for everything that you need to create one of those plugins, and also help you register it on a cPanel and WHM server. Additional guides explain some special options for plugins. You won't always need all of these extra tools, but they can be extremely helpful for the right project. We use Template Toolkit to perform front-end interface development. So our guide to Template Toolkit describes how to use Template Toolkit with cPanel products. It also describes how to use our locale system with Template Toolkit. The guide to package extensions shows you how to create a package extension, which adds custom fields to packages and accounts in WHM. The guide to app config gives all of the information about our app config system, which allows you to register WHM plugins. As you can see, our SDK's development guides go beyond APIs to give recommended workflows and additional references for topics and systems that you can use to integrate with us, and best practices to make sure that your integration with us is seamless. So far, I've only shown you a handful of our most popular guides. Depending on your integration project, you might also like to check out some of our other guides. For example, we have a guide to the Live API system, which is an environment for applications that run in cPanel's X3 theme. A guide to privilege escalation for using our pluggable wrapper system to run functions with elevated privileges. A guide to the various Perl environments in cPanel and WHM. A guide to the global variables that you can access through the Live API and Dynamic UI systems. A guide to our localization system, which you can add to and customize. And localization is definitely going to be important for a lot of projects, and the system that we use is extremely feature-rich, so we definitely encourage you to check out what you can do with that system. And we give you a guide to creating plugins to update DNS records on external systems. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, our SDK also includes a section of development tutorials. These are a great way for beginners to see how everything fits together, since we try to put the individual tasks in the context of a larger project. Even experienced developers might want to take a look at these, since we try to incorporate best practices and tips and tricks into each tutorial. So far, we've added quite a few tutorials. We have a tutorial for creating cPanel plugins. These tutorials will help you blend seamlessly with the look and feel of the existing cPanel interfaces in either X3 or the Paper Lantern theme. And there are several of these that give you all of the options in various programming languages. We have tutorials for calling some of our trickier API functions, like SSL and file-related functions. And we have tutorials for creating standardized hook code. Even without an accompanying plugin, these tutorials are great for anyone who just needs to customize one or two facets of how their servers work. We write these tutorials with a complete beginner in mind, with code examples in multiple languages, line-by-line explanations of code, links for more information, and of course a finished piece of code at the end of every tutorial. If you wanted to, you could theoretically run this custom code on your cPanel and WHM server. So the SDK already holds a lot of information, but we're not done yet. In the near future, we're hoping to add a lot more. We want to add more tutorials based on real use cases and tutorials on how to test your code. Right now, we're working on a complete tutorial for all of the parts of a functional WHM plugin. We're going to add more code examples in some of our most popular guides and tutorials to show you more options on how you can write your code. We're working on adding links between the equivalent versions of functions in cPanel API 1, cPanel API 2, and UAPI, so that you can make sure you're always using the most up-to-date function in your custom code. And finally, we're going to add links from API functions and hookable events to the cPanel, WHM, or Manage2 interfaces that call them, so that you know where to go in the interface to test your code. We hope that our SDK helps you get the most out of cPanel and WHM's integration systems. Of course, the most important thing about any documentation is how it helps you get the job done. With that in mind, please let us know if there's any documentation that you'd like to see. If you have any questions or comments about this presentation, please feel free to email me at sarah.kanairi@cpanel.net or on Twitter @sarahkanairi.